There comes a moment in life, especially when you have lived more than 6 decades on this earth, when your spirit grows tired of disappointment. You grow tired of leaders who speak loudly but stand softly, men who promise mountains yet deliver dust. And if you are an elder of the African diaspora, if you have watched our people rise and fall, hope and lose hope, build and be broken, then you understand this truth more deeply than most. Trust is not given lightly. Trust is earned with fire. That is why something extraordinary happened in Jamaica. A group of retired soldiers, men who had seen conflict, men who had buried friends, men who had marched under flags that did not always protect them, gathered and spoke with one voice. These were not dreamers. These were not naive boys. These were veterans. And they said something no one expected. Traore, yes. We trust that man. Why? What did they see? What did they recognize in a young captain from Burkina Faso that they had not seen in their own leaders for half a century? Stay with me, Elder. We are going to walk through this story slowly, truthfully, and with the weight it deserves. And if you believe stories like this must continue to be told, please consider subscribing. Your presence strengthens this community. When the retired soldiers of Jamaica gathered that evening, the room itself felt heavy. It was an old community hall, the kind built in the 1960s, when the island still believed independence meant freedom, and freedom meant dignity. The walls were cracked from time. The wooden tables carried the stains of 1,000 forgotten meetings, and the overhead fans moved just enough air to remind everyone how warm the night had become. But none of that mattered, because the men who sat in that room were not there for comfort. They were there because their hearts had grown restless. Old Sergeant Donovan Reed was the first to speak. He was a tall man, shoulders still squared despite the years, voice deep from decades of command. He placed both hands on the table and said, "Brothers, we have served this country from boyhood to gray hair. We have watched politicians shake our hands and forget our names. We have seen treaties signed that weakened us, agreements accepted that silenced us, partnerships formed that never protected us. And now, after 60 years of loyalty, tell me who in high office still fights for Jamaica?" Silence answered him. Major Carlton Hines, once stationed in Sierra Leone during a peacekeeping mission, cleared his throat. His voice cracked with age, but it carried the weight of a man who had seen the world's coldest truths. "I have watched leaders across continents," he said. "Some were strong in speech, but weak in backbone. Some were soft in heart, but hard in cruelty. Some wanted power while pretending to want peace. But a few weeks ago, I saw a different kind of man." The veterans leaned forward. Carlton continued. "I saw a young captain standing before his people, not with fear, not with apology, not with the body language of a man who serves foreign masters, but with the fire of someone who has nothing to lose except his honor." He was speaking, of course, about Ibrahim Traoré. The room stirred. They had all seen the broadcasts, some on television, some through a shared mobile phone, some through clips replayed by their grandchildren. Lieutenant Marlon Stewart, who had once trained recruits at Up Park Camp, clenched his fist. "Do you know what struck me?" he asked the room. Not his youth, not his uniform, not even his courage. It was the way he looked at the men standing behind him. He looked at them as equals, not subordinates, as brothers, not tools. "I have served under many commanders. Few ever looked at us that way." This was where the anger began to rise, because every man in that room had once believed in the promise of Caribbean leadership. They had given their sweat to Jamaica, their loyalty to Jamaica, even their blood to Jamaica. And yet, through the decades, they watched their island bend under economic pressure, foreign influence, and political compromise. They remembered the years when imported advisors seemed to have more authority than elected Jamaicans. They remembered when decisions affecting Kingston were whispered in Washington, Ottawa, and London before they were spoken in Parliament. They remembered when agriculture was weakened, when industries were sold off, when ordinary citizens felt the weight of policies designed elsewhere. And as they remembered, their nostalgia turned into something sharper. "We were used," Donovan said quietly. "Used to guard interests that never belonged to us, sent to secure borders that were never truly ours, given medals but denied dignity. And now, when we look at our own region, at our own leaders," he shook his head, "we see fear. Fear of offending powerful nations, fear of standing firm, fear of losing foreign approval." This was the wound. This was why the appearance of Traoré felt like a lightning strike to their spirit. Because here was a leader who looked unbothered by intimidation, untouched by shame, unfazed by threats. He spoke as though he had no master above him but truth. Captain Ashton Burke, who rarely spoke in meetings, finally raised his hand. "When I looked at that young man," he said slowly, "I felt something I have not felt since I was 20. I felt pride. Not for my country, but for my race, for our people, for our story. I saw a man who carried the anger of our ancestors and the hope of our grandchildren at the same time." The veterans nodded. Because whether they lived in Kingston, Montego Bay, Black River, or abroad in Toronto or Birmingham, they had spent decades watching their heritage drown beneath the weight of foreign narratives. They watched African leaders mocked, Caribbean leaders pressured, and diaspora communities divided. But Traoré felt different. Raw, unfiltered, unafraid. And for a generation of black men who had lived long enough to grow wary of promises, this was not a small thing. It was a shock. It was a spark. It was a summons. One of the men, Private Lennox Gordon, leaned back and said what everyone else was too cautious to say aloud. "Brothers, what if this man is the sign we have been waiting for?" His question hung in the room. And that was the moment when a gathering of weary soldiers transformed into something else. Their conversation shifted, their breath steadied, their eyes sharpened. It was no longer about observing a leader from afar. It was becoming something far more serious, something that would soon push them to take a step no one expected. Because after that night, something happened that would change the course of their discussions completely. The turning point came one rainy afternoon, when former warrant officer Leonard Clark arrived at the Veterans Hall carrying a small tablet wrapped in a cloth. He placed it gently at the center of the table, as if laying down evidence in a courtroom. The men gathered around him, and he tapped the screen. A video appeared, a clip they had all seen before, but never together. Never analyzed, never broken down the way soldiers examine battlefield footage. In the clip, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood beneath the scorching Sahel sun, sleeves rolled, eyes steady, voice unwavering. He spoke not like a politician, not like a rehearsed official, but like a man who understood that every word carried a cost. His tone was calm yet fierce, humble yet thunderous, disciplined yet defiantly free. It was the kind of moment that does not need special lighting or editing. It was an Ibrahim Traoré moment. The room fell completely silent. You could hear the fans circling. You could hear the rain outside. You could hear the breath of elderly men who had lived long enough to recognize when truth was not being stretched or softened or shaped by someone else's agenda. Sergeant Donovan Reed whispered, "Look at his eyes. He is not speaking to please. He is speaking to prepare." Major Carlton Hines added, "And look at the men behind him. They are not props. They are not there for ceremony. They trust him. They believe him. You can see it in their stance." The veterans watched the clip again, then once more. Each time, a different detail stood out. To Lieutenant Marlon Stewart, it was the way Traoré never flinched when referencing powerful nations. "Only a man who has freed himself can speak like that," Marlon murmured. To Captain Ashton Burke, it was the steadiness of Traoré's breath. "That is a soldier's breathing," he said. "Slow, measured, controlled. He has seen real threat, and he has learnt not to blink." To Private Lennox Gordon, it was the way Traoré framed responsibility. He does not say, "you people," he says, "we." That is what leadership used to sound like. And as they watched, something began to rise inside them. Not just admiration, not just curiosity, but a quiet, deep ache. An ache called regret. Because for more than 5 decades, the Caribbean had been handed leaders who talked about sovereignty while signing deals that surrendered it. Leaders who promised transformation, yet cowered at the slightest pressure. Leaders who spoke of regional unity, but often acted alone. Leaders who showed more urgency when speaking to foreign diplomats than when speaking to their own people. And these veterans, the men who had worn Jamaica's uniform with pride, felt this ache sharply. Major Hines, who had spent years training young recruits, exhaled slowly. "I spent my life teaching discipline, courage, and loyalty, but we rarely had examples to point to. We told our young men to stand tall, but our leaders rarely did. That is why this hurts." He paused, voice trembling not from weakness, but from memory. Imagine if we had someone like this when we were 20. Jamaica would not be the Jamaica we know today. A murmur of agreement filled the room. It was not resentment, not bitterness, not jealousy. It was mourning for opportunities lost, for decades wasted, for a region that could have risen higher had it been guided by conviction rather than caution. Warrant Officer Clark swiped to the next clip. It showed crowds across West Africa reacting to Traoré's speech, cheering, dancing, crying, lifting flags, chanting in unity. Some were barefoot, some were poor, some were too young to understand politics, but old enough to understand dignity. This was the Ibrahim Traoré reaction that had spread across the continent. Captain Burke leaned closer and whispered, "Do you hear that? That is the sound of people remembering who they are." For a moment, none of the veterans spoke. The rain continued falling. The fans kept spinning, but the room felt fuller, heavier, almost reverent. Because what they were watching was not merely politics. It was identity. It was reclamation. It was the awakening of a posture that had been bent for too long. Lieutenant Stewart broke the silence. "Gentlemen, we are looking at a young man doing what our generation was too divided, too pressured, or too tired to do." Private Gordon added, "Or too misled to do." Old Sergeant Reed shook his head. "No, we tried. Many of us did. But we did not have a leader who refused to bend. A leader who refused to negotiate himself. This boy, he reminds me of what we hoped the future would look like." The regret in the room deepened. But woven through it was something unexpected. Hope. Hope not for themselves, but for the grandchildren they worried about every night. Hope for the Caribbean they feared had been lost. Hope for the diaspora that had been scattered across oceans and borders. Major Hines stood up slowly. "Brothers, we cannot sit in this hall and admire him from a distance. We must decide whether we are simply observers or whether we are participants in this new moment." That was the sentence that changed everything, because the veterans did not just admire Traoré. They did not just analyze him. They began to ask themselves a question that would lead them into uncharted territory. What if this young captain is not simply a leader, but a call? And the decision they made next would ripple far beyond that small Jamaican hall, because what they chose to do after this surprised even their own families. When the Jamaican veterans reconvened a week later, the atmosphere in the hall had changed. It no longer felt like a gathering of aging soldiers sharing memories. It felt like something awakening, something long delayed, something that had been waiting for a spark strong enough to rise from the ashes of disappointment. Old Sergeant Donovan Reed entered with a folder tucked under his arm, the kind used in military briefings. His steps were slow, not from weakness, but from the weight of contemplation. He placed the folder on the table, looked around at the familiar faces, and said, "Brothers, it is time to move." The men exchanged glances. Lieutenant Marlon Stewart leaned forward. "Move? In what sense?" Donovan opened the folder. Inside were printed statements, some handwritten, some typed, some scribbled on scraps of paper torn from old notebooks. Every page carried the same essence: respect for the young Burkinabè officer they had been studying. He took a deep breath. "I asked each of you to put in writing what you felt when you watched him speak. Not for the history books, for your own clarity." I read every word. He paused, letting silence do its work. And do you know what I found? Not admiration, not excitement, not fascination. I found grief. The men lowered their eyes. Not because they disagreed, but because they recognized the truth. Grief for the leaders they never had. Grief for the years lost in compromise. Grief for the strength their region allowed to diminish. Grief for the pride that was quietly taken from them, piece by piece, policy by policy, year by year. Major Carlton Hines exhaled deeply. "We served in foreign missions. We trained under foreign advisors. We defended foreign interests. And afterwards, we watched our own homelands struggle to breathe. Sometimes I wonder if we were fighting the wrong battles." No one corrected him, because it was not sadness that filled the room now, but clarity. Warrant Officer Leonard Clark stood up next. He held a small notebook filled with names. "These are Jamaican veterans living in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Men from Kingston, Montego Bay, St. Elizabeth, Clarendon, Brixton, Toronto, and Miami. They have seen the same clips we watched. And do you know what some of them told me?" He opened the notebook and read, "If that young man was Caribbean, we would march behind him. He speaks with courage our leaders lost. If Africa rises, we rise with her." The veterans nodded solemnly. It was not just Jamaica reacting. It was the Caribbean. It was the diaspora. It was the global community of elders who had carried disappointment on their backs for more than half a century. Lieutenant Stewart paced slowly across the hall. "We are old soldiers. We do not chase fantasies. We do not fall for charm. If we say we recognize discipline, it is because we lived discipline." He stopped walking and looked each man in the eye. "This is why we must take a stand. Not for politics, not for fame, for our grandchildren." His voice trembled, not from fear, but from conviction. "Do you want our grandchildren to inherit a Caribbean that bows? or a Caribbean that stands? The question struck the room like a drumbeat. And then, almost unexpectedly, hope began to rise. Private Lennox Gordon, who rarely spoke above a murmur, lifted his head. Gentlemen, what if this is our chance? Not to fight with guns again, but to give our voices, to add weight to a movement rising across the Atlantic. A movement of dignity. Eyes brightened. Captain Ashton Burke added, "We cannot change the past. We were born into an era that sabotaged many of our dreams. But this new generation might have a leader who is not afraid. A leader who could push the world to look at black nations with respect again." For the first time that evening, smiles appeared. Small, fragile smiles like candles lit in a long, dark room. Sergeant Reed then revealed the true purpose of the meeting. He pulled out a letter. Not a short letter. A declaration. "We have drafted a public statement," he announced. "One that expresses our respect for leadership that stands firm, speaks boldly, and defends its people without apology. We will release it as a collective, not as individuals. As Jamaican veterans." The men sat up straighter. Marlon Stewart read the letter silently, eyes scanning each line. When he finished, he nodded slowly. This speaks truth." "It does," Carlton Hines agreed. "And truth is overdue." But Leonard Clark was not finished. He pulled out a second document. "Several of our brothers in the diaspora want to co-sign. From the United States Army, from the British forces, from the Canadian Reserves. Black veterans who understand exactly what we have lived." A stunned quiet fell over the room, as if something much larger than themselves was forming. Not a movement of soldiers, not a movement of politicians, a movement of elders, elders reclaiming dignity, elders sending a message, elders finally standing without fear. Private Gordon whispered, "Do you realize what this means?" And the truth settled on all of them like a rising dawn. This was no longer about admiration. This was no longer about a speech. This was no longer about nostalgia. This was alignment. A generation long silenced finally finding its voice again. Then Sergeant Reed said the words that carried the entire room into stillness. "Brothers, America will see this. London will see this. Ottawa will see this. The Caribbean will see this. Africa will see this. Once we release this statement, there is no turning back." The rain outside stopped. The fans kept spinning. The men looked at one another with the seriousness of those about to cross a threshold. Because they knew everything was about to change. And just as their statement began spreading, another force far more powerful began watching them closely. When the Veterans' Declaration began circulating online, it did not stay in Jamaica for long. Within 2 days, it reached Birmingham and Toronto. Within 4 days, it reached Miami, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. And by the end of the week, it had reached desks in places far removed from Caribbean hardship desks, with polished wood, guarded doors, and quiet hallways where decisions echo through continents. The first official reaction came quietly. A retired Jamaican veteran living in Maryland, Captain Joseph Grant, phoned Sergeant Donovan Reed late at night. "Brother," he said, "your statement is being discussed in Washington. Some circles do not like it. They do not like old soldiers giving their blessing to a leader they cannot predict." This was not surprising to the men, because the world had been watching Ibrahim Traoré with the caution reserved for those who do not behave according to expectations. Western analysts described him with words like unconventional, uncontrolled, untamed, and dangerously independent. Newspapers in Europe called him a symbol of regional instability, while headlines in North America questioned whether he represented a break from the international order. But ordinary people, especially black people across the diaspora, did not use those words. Captain Ashton Burke pointed this out during the next meeting. When the West sees a young African officer who refuses to fold, they call it radical. When our people see him, they call it real. How long has it been since authenticity scared the powerful? Lieutenant Marlon Stewart nodded. They prefer leaders who nod politely, sign quietly, and obey consistently. They do not know how to respond to someone who does none of these things. Meanwhile, the Caribbean's reaction was more divided. Some local commentators praised the veterans for speaking boldly. Others accused them of being sentimental, misled, or influenced by online rhetoric. A few Caribbean politicians issued carefully measured statements about regional stability and the importance of long-standing partnerships. But beneath the cautious language, something else was moving, a current of discomfort. Major Carlton Hines said it plainly. When elders speak, the young listen. When veterans speak, nations listen. And when black veterans speak, the world gets nervous. He was not wrong. Because international think tanks began publishing articles asking why the Caribbean was suddenly aligning emotionally with West Africa. Diplomatic offices requested internal briefs. A European newspaper ran a headline saying, "Retired soldiers stir unpredictable solidarity." Yet the most revealing reaction came from the United States. A Jamaican veteran living in Florida, Lieutenant Paul Morrison, shared what he overheard during a private discussion. They said Traore is becoming an influence symbol, not because of military power, because of psychological power. That is what worries them. Psychological power, the power of representation, the power of dignity, the power of a young African refusing to bow. The veterans in Jamaica sat quietly as they absorbed this. Sergeant Reed said softly, "We are witnessing a shift. A small shift now, but one that could grow. And when shifts begin, powerful nations try to calculate where they lead." Warrant Officer Leonard Clark folded his arms, and when they cannot calculate, they intervene. The room fell into a deep stillness, because although hope had risen in their hearts, the veterans knew the world was rarely gentle with leaders who inspired genuine unity among black nations. Lieutenant Stewart spoke the thought everyone feared. If the world sees him as a threat, then our public support might put a target on all of us. No one replied, because they understood something larger than themselves was unfolding, something that crossed oceans, governments, and generations. And they understood that once a movement begins, the world rarely allows it to grow without challenge. And just as they recognized this, news arrived that would shake every man in that room. The news that reached the veterans struck with the weight of a hammer. Lieutenant Paul Morrison, calling from Florida once again, delivered it with a voice tight and steady. "Brothers, a regional briefing has been issued. Caribbean governments are being advised to monitor any public endorsements of foreign leaders, especially those considered unpredictable." Sergeant Donovan Reed closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words settle like dust. It was not an open threat, but it was a warning. Major Carlton Hines spoke first. "So the world has noticed us, more than we expected." Warrant Officer Leonard Clark responded calmly, "That means we are standing in the right place." The men did not gather to bend. They gathered to understand. And now, understanding had arrived with clarity sharper than any blade. Lieutenant Marlon Stewart walked to the window and looked outside at the dim street lamps. "We are old soldiers. We know pressure when we feel it. But tell me this, should we retreat because someone is uncomfortable with our honesty? No one answered, because they already knew the answer. Hope, however fragile, was no longer a fleeting feeling. It had become a direction. Captain Ashton Burke placed both hands firmly on the table. If our children and grandchildren inherit a Caribbean that behaves only in ways approved by others, then what have we preserved? What have we defended? What was the purpose of our service? Silence filled the hall again. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of awakening. Sergeant Reed finally spoke. We have reached a crossroads. One path leads to comfort, the other leads to truth, and truth always comes with cost. The men straightened their backs, as though instinctively preparing for parade rest. Private Lennox Gordon, voice soft but unshakable, added, "If a young African leader chooses courage, then the least we, as elders, can choose is consistency." This was the turning of the tide. The veterans did not seek glory. They did not seek conflict. They sought alignment with the values they had carried throughout their lives: discipline, dignity, clarity, courage. Major Hines looked at each man. What is the future we want? For Jamaica? For the Caribbean? For the Diaspora? The answers came slowly, each one a stone placed into a foundation, a region that stands tall, a generation that is not afraid, a people that remember who they are, a future built on unity, not obedience. Warrant Officer Clark stepped forward. Then we must continue. Quietly, firmly, respectfully, we must guide younger voices. We must encourage dialogue between the Caribbean and Africa, and we must remain vigilant, because movements built on dignity attract both admiration and resistance. Lieutenant Stewart added, and we must protect one another. Once you speak truth, you cannot walk alone. As he said this, the men nodded not as individuals, but as a collective, an unbroken line of elders making one final stand in a world that often prefers them silent. Sergeant Donovan Reed addressed them with a solemn authority that only 6 decades of living could produce. Gentlemen, the road ahead will not be smooth. There will be scrutiny. There will be pressure. There will be voices telling us to step back. But if we truly believe this moment is meaningful, then stepping back is no longer an option. The air in the hall grew still. It was no longer a conversation. It was a commitment. And then Sergeant Reed said the sentence that turned hope into resolve. We must prepare ourselves, because the next development will not be gentle. The men exchanged a long, steady look. They understood something was coming, and when it arrived, it would test everything they believed. In the weeks that followed, the veterans of Jamaica found themselves standing at the threshold of a new season. They were old men with tired bones, but their spirits felt strangely renewed, as if a long dormant drum inside their chests had begun to beat again. What they witnessed across the ocean was not simply political motion. It was not merely a government reshuffling its alliances. It was something deeper, something older, something spiritual. It was dignity returning to a place where dignity had been denied. Sergeant Donovan Reed said it best when he addressed the group one final time. My brothers, we are living through a turning of history. We have served, we have struggled, we have survived. But now we are watching a young man in Burkina Faso remind a wounded world that black leadership does not need permission to stand tall. For these veterans, the first Ibrahim Traoré moment was not a clip, not a headline, not a gesture. It was a mirror held up to the diaspora, showing them a posture they had forgotten, a posture of rootedness, of clarity, of righteous defiance. And the second Ibrahim Traoré moment came not from his speech, but from the silent awakening inside elders who had long felt ignored. It was the moment they realized they were not witnessing a chapter, they were witnessing a shift. And the world felt it too. Because the Ibrahim Traoré reaction traveling across continents was not based on power, wealth, or international alliances. It was based on something much rarer: authenticity. A young captain refusing to bow has a way of making old men stand straighter. Major Carlton Hines looked around the hall during their final gathering. His voice trembled as he spoke. We cannot live our lives again, but we can guide the future. We can tell our grandchildren what strength looks like. We can tell them that courage does not age. And we can tell them that Africa is rising, and we must rise with her. So now, elder of the diaspora, the question rests with you. What do you see when you look at this moment in history? Do you see fear, or do you see possibility? Do you see instability, or do you see awakening? Do you believe the Caribbean and Africa can stand together at last? If this story stirred something within you, please subscribe. Your presence keeps this community strong, and your voice matters. And before you leave, share this in the comments. What legacy do you want the next generation of Black youth to inherit?